Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Now let's get started with our story about Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. On August 31st, 1940, Laurence Olivier married Vivien Leigh at the San Isidro Ranch Resort in Montecito, California, far from the couple's native Great Britain. The ceremony was attended by only 4 people: actor Ronald Colman and his wife Benita, Katharine Hepburn, and Garson Kanin. The small affair and remote location was indicative of the tumultuous circumstances surrounding the marriage. Both Olivier and Leigh had left their spouses and young children for each other years earlier. Both of these former partners initially refused to agree to a divorce, but with Leigh in 1939 having enjoyed a career breakthrough as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and Olivier also receiving an Academy Award nomination in the same year for his appearance in Wuthering Heights, and their relationship now common knowledge, their ex-spouses finally capitulated to reality. Although this union would produce one of the most high-profile celebrity romances of the 20th century, as well as 2 of the most notable dramatic careers in the history of entertainment, it was also marked by infidelity, divorce, Vivien Leigh's severe mental illness, and premature death at the age of 53. Laurence Olivier was born on May 22, 1907, in the small southeastern English town of Dorking. His father, Gerard Olivier, was then a clerical assistant in a nearby church. A 38-year-old former failed teacher, he decided shortly after his son's birth to relocate to a new church in an impoverished area of London. Gerard relocated his ministry to the Nottingdale section of the city, a slum with some of the filthiest and wretched tenement housing in Greater London. Fortunately, the family, the minister, his wife Agnes, Laurence, and his older brother and sister lived about a mile away in a more pleasant part of Notting Hill. Unfortunately, Gerard Olivier was prone to histrionic sermons that were way over the top, quickly earning the reputation as a zealot as opposed to a benevolent Christian intent on helping a desperately needy congregation. Within a year, Gerard Olivier was terminated from his church position, a development that made an already precarious living situation a suddenly catastrophic set of circumstances. He and the family bounced around for a few years before Gerard secured another permanent church-related position in the Pimlico district of London. Although Olivier's own autobiographical recollections attempt to paint a picture of perpetual economic deprivation, in fact, despite any modest church stipend, Gerard Olivier's father was a prosperous banker who left a considerable estate in trust for all of his children. While not particularly successful, Gerard Olivier was able to provide a reasonable household for his family, his wife also coming from a modestly affluent background. Personally, Gerard Olivier was not a particularly happy individual, and he was especially negative towards his youngest son, Laurence. Luckily, possibly as the baby in the family, and possibly because she recognized the lack of any paternal affection, from a very young age, Olivier had an extremely close relationship with his mother, Agnes. In any case, the fact that the family did have some economic resources was underlined when at age 9, Olivier was enrolled at the All Saints School, a choir school affiliated with the All Saints Church. His brother already attended this institution, which provided extensive training in both music and choral song, as well as a classical education in such subjects as Latin, French, and history. His academics were reasonable, but his singing ability was excellent. All Saints was also Olivier's first exposure to drama, including Shakespeare, something that immediately interested him. When his father took a rector's position 30 miles north of London, he was left to board at All Saints, a not unusual arrangement. Unfortunately, at the age of 12, the death of his mother intruded on what had been a perfectly ordinary adolescence. In ill health over what was originally diagnosed as a form of muscular dystrophy, Agnes Olivier actually was suffering from an extremely rare but malevolent form of brain cancer that ended her life on March 27, 1920, aged 48. This was devastating at the time, Olivier now left with only one much more distant and unaffectionate parent. Life went on, and for Olivier, this meant entering public school, the British equivalent of the American prep school, in this case St. Edward's in Oxford, a fairly typical school of its type. During this time period, it was generally decided that he would pursue acting as a career, and after 3 years at St. Edward's, he applied to the Central School of Speech Training and Dramatic Art. Olivier's sister, Sybil, already an aspiring actress, had attended the same institution and was popular with the school's headmistress, Anne Elsie Fogarty, so much so that Olivier was not only admitted, but also received a modest scholarship. He spent 1 year at Central, as it was known, before attempting to seek dramatic work. After finding sporadic employment with various obscure repertory companies, in 1927, Olivier became a regular with the Birmingham Repertory Theatre, one of the country's most respected theatre groups. He appeared in a wide range of plays, ranging from Shakespeare to Chekhov, excellent professional preparation for a 20-year-old. His performances did not go unnoticed. By 1928, he was cast in a London production called Bird in Hand. One of his female co-stars was Jill Esmond. Olivier became romantically involved with Esmond, and despite several stage flops that included a laughably bad production of the French Foreign Legion epic Beau Geste, Olivier's reputation as well as salary grew. In 1930, offered a part in New York, Olivier eagerly agreed, chiefly because Jill Esmond was already there, appearing in the U.S. production of Bird in Hand. Unfortunately, his play closed after only 6 weeks, but he did buy Jill an engagement ring, the actress accepting it without committing to any specifics. While she remained in the U.S., he returned to Britain. Once there, Olivier made a professional discovery that influenced the rest of his dramatic career. The realization that the exploding motion picture industry, which he considered insignificant in comparison to the stage, was much more lucrative and didn't require as much effort, essentially easy money. When he was cast in a secondary role in the Noel Coward play Private Lives, Olivier felt his career was secure enough to get married, and Jill Esmond agreed, the ceremony occurring on July 25, 1930. In his early 20s, with typically little experience in any kind of serious emotional involvement, Olivier quickly realized that he and Jill were not a good match. In his autobiography, many years later, he wrote, "My wife doesn't suit me. It really did look like a pretty crass mistake. I had insisted on getting married from a mixture of religious and animal promptings." Nevertheless, the couple quickly returned to work. Coward's Private Lives was quite successful, running for 3 months in London before the playwright shut it down, intent on taking it to New York. When a fellow female cast member dropped out, Jill was cast as her replacement, and early in 1931, the Oliviers crossed the Atlantic, arriving in New York. Private Lives was just as successful in New York, and both husband and wife also took the opportunity to undergo numerous movie studio screen tests. Although Olivier's salary was double what his wife was paid for their Private Lives performances, ironically, Jill received a 1-year contract from Fox for $8.75 a week, guaranteed for a year, a significant offer. while Laurence did not get any bites. Initially, Jill did not wish to go to California, especially by herself, but eventually Olivier also received an offer of $1,000 a week from RKO, with a 2-year additional option at $1,400 a week. Ultimately, the couple came to the realization that this was too much money to turn down. Unfortunately, their first Hollywood experience was negative. Olivier made 3 forgettable films in 2 years, his last losing a substantial bit of money. 29-year-old David O. Selznick was brought in to whip RKO into shape, the Depression finally having an impact on the film industry. Most likely, before he was released from his contract, Olivier decided to return to Britain. Jill's time in Hollywood was even less productive. Although considered for several high-profile roles, she received a salary without appearing in any films of substance. Surprisingly, after his less-than-happy experience in California, Olivier's first work upon returning to Britain was in film for Ealing Studios, the first with Gloria Swanson, attempting one of her many screen comebacks, and the second with his wife Jill. Both were flops, but such steady work and their previous American film wages allowed for a newfound extravagance, including a new residence on the Chelsea Embankment overlooking the Thames, the former studio of James McNeill Whistler. Extravagantly redecorated, Olivier was further encouraged to spend lavishly when he received rave notices for his latest play, The Rats of Norway. When Hollywood inevitably began calling again, he was much more deliberate in his negotiations. He flatly rejected an MGM offer of 1 year at $1,000 a week, not wanting to commit to such a long period overseas. MGM then followed up with a much more enticing proposition, $1,500 a week to play opposite Greta Garbo in her latest film, Queen Christina. Olivier dickered over first-class transportation, a potential role for Jill, and the duration of his salary, but such a potentially groundbreaking opportunity was again irresistible. The mere casting of Olivier in such a role opposite Garbo was huge news in the British press, and as Atlantic Crossing was noted, the actor sensing that his star was ascending to new heights. Unfortunately, despite initial positive publicity interactions with the mercurial Swedish superstar, Olivier quickly lost his footing. Possibly intimidated and certainly nervous, he had zero chemistry with Garbo in the first 2 weeks of shooting, and the actress, whose contract stipulated that she had control over who could play her leading man, indicated that she wasn't comfortable with him. He was quickly fired and replaced by John Gilbert, consoling himself with collecting several more weeks of his $1,500 a week salary and taking Jill on a holiday to Honolulu's Royal Hawaiian Hotel. While there, he received a cable for another $1,500 a week contract from Metro, guaranteed for a year. Unhappy with what he considered to be shabby treatment, he did not dignify the offer with a response. He also decided during his transcontinental American return by train that he would never be subjected to such crude transportation again. He already had another job up his sleeve, a play in New York entitled The Green Bay Tree. He then returned to England, where he produced a play entitled Golden Arrow, which opened on May 30th, 1935. It lasted barely 2 weeks and was notable chiefly as the professional debut of Greer Garson. With his career in a stall and Jill barely able to find any work at all, Olivier then had a change of luck when the noted Shakespearean actor John Gielgud offered him the part of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. Gielgud had already achieved a major success playing the title role of Hamlet in a London production that lasted for 6 months. He was intent on following up on the momentum with a second high-profile Shakespeare play. Starting in October of 1935 and intended for 6 weeks, the play with Peggy Ashcroft as Juliet ran for 6 months. To this day, the longest continuous production of Romeo and Juliet since its inception. For Olivier, it was the first of many Shakespearean roles that were a mainstay of his impressive career. As 1936 began, his future again seemed to be on the upswing. 1936 was also the year that another individual came into his life, although at first their interaction remained strictly professional. Vivien Leigh, a.k.a. Vivien Mary Hartley, was born on November 5, 1913, in Darjeeling, present-day India. Then a British province, her father, Ernest, worked in the brokerage business in Calcutta and was reasonably prosperous. Her mother, Gertrude, was born in Darjeeling, and her nationality seems to be a mixture of Irish, Armenian, and even part Indian. Her exotic background undoubtedly contributed to her daughter's extraordinary beauty. Her mother was also a devout Roman Catholic, prompting her to travel with her daughter to London, where Vivien, an only child, was enrolled in the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Roehampton, a London suburb. She remained in this school for 8 years, her parents returning from India during the summer months, the family then extensively traveling to various upscale tourist locations throughout Europe. At age 14, she attended a succession of boarding schools in Italy, France, and Germany, and then, already intent on an acting career, she enrolled at London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art at the age of 18, her parents having also recently returned from India. Vivien's acting career was quickly sidetracked after she met a 32-year-old barrister named Leigh Holman. Although only 19, she married Holman and quickly gave birth to a daughter named Suzanne. But she remained intent on pursuing acting, changed her professional name, adapting her husband's first name into Vivien Leigh. Despite acquiring an agent, she had to settle for bit parts and small roles until she was cast in a prominent role in the May 1935 play The Mask of Virtue. It was here that Olivier first caught her performance. When exactly they became romantically involved is not known, but by 1936, when both were cast in the film Fire Over England, a historical drama concerning the Spanish Armada, their relationship, although still covert, was well underway. Filming began on July 15th, only a month before the birth of Jill Esmond and Olivier's first child, a son Simon, eventually known by his middle name of Tarquin, born on August 21st. Thus began a 2-year period which Olivier later described as a, quote, furtive life, lying life, in which he described feelings of guilt as he behaved like a really worm-like adulterer, slipping in between another man's sheets. Strangely, he and his wife Jill took to frequently socializing with Vivien Leigh and her husband, who, unlike Jill Esmond, seemed to have no idea that his wife was carrying on with another man. Leigh taking long yachting trips to the Baltic, and even letting Vivien travel alone to Italy, where she just happened to run into Olivier and Jill on the island of Capri, accidentally on purpose. For her part, Jill may have hoped that this was just another affair on her husband's part. He had a habit of sleeping with many of his female co-stars, including Peggy Ashcroft. Perhaps this particular relationship would also fade. In the midst of this domestic drama, Olivier made the conscious decision to focus on Shakespearean roles. He even had a venue in mind where this was possible, the Victoria Theatre, nicknamed the Old Vic. Opened in 1818 as a multi-purpose showcase, by 1914 it exclusively presented Shakespearean plays. Although Gielgud and Ralph Richardson had appeared in some of these productions, Olivier, who already had a fairly high profile as a film star, would be the most popular actor ever to appear for a full season at the Old Vic. The high-profile owner and operator of the venue, Lillian Bayliss, reminded him that his pay would be the usual £25 a week, a steep pay cut for the actor, who by then could easily command at least £500 a week in British cinema, and possibly more if he was willing to spend time in Los Angeles. But Olivier believed that to establish himself as a truly great actor, he needed to excel in some of theater's most prominent roles. Needless to say, after consulting with the venue's director, he chose Hamlet as the first production. From January 5, 1937, until May 22nd, he appeared in 3 separate productions of Hamlet, Twelfth Night, and Henry V. During this run, on February 24th, the premiere of Fire Over England, attended by both government officials and cultural icons including A. Milne and H. G. Wells, took place, a gala that was splashed all over print media. Although Jill Esmond appeared in the Old Vic production of Twelfth Night, Olivier's clandestine affair with Vivien Leigh continued and possibly prompted his next theatrical venture. Attempting an even more authentic production of Hamlet, Olivier negotiated for the use of Kronborg Castle in Denmark, the actual setting for the fictional Elsinore in Hamlet. Although Jill Esmond would accompany him overseas, Vivien Leigh, who had not appeared in the London Old Vic production, was suddenly cast as Ophelia, Olivier insisting upon this development. 6 open-air performances were scheduled, a celebration of the silver jubilee of the reign of King Christian X. But for the first performance, a torrential downpour sent the entire production scurrying indoors to the ballroom of a nearby hotel. With much of the Danish royal family and numerous high society types from Britain in attendance, a cancellation was unthinkable. Both the first night's improvised presentation and the remaining performances were well received, and they also put the final nail into both of Olivier and Leigh's marriages. Many years later, in his memoirs, the actor confessed that even on stage, we could not keep from touching each other, making love almost within Jill's vision. This welding closeness tripped the obvious decision, and 2 marriages were severed. But this emotional stress seemed to have triggered within Vivien Leigh some kind of manic episode in which, behind closed doors, seemingly out of nowhere, she began screaming at Olivier, hysterical, her language peppered with the most vile obscenities. Then, just as quickly, she was quiet and began to prepare for that evening's performance. Although stunned, Olivier glossed over the episode, and by the next day, everything was back to normal. Upon everyone's return to London, Jill Esmond, sensing that she needed to do something drastic to save her marriage, decided to confront Vivien Leigh personally. Having frequently socialized with Leigh and her husband on many occasions, Jill made an appointment to visit Leigh alone at Vivien's apartment. Her romantic rival greeted her with champagne, and when Jill confronted her about exactly what was transpiring between the 2 lovers, she was completely nullified by Vivien's matter-of-fact explanation that she fully intended to marry Olivier. Considering that both women were socially familiar with each other, they remained cordial, to the point of Vivien finishing the conversation by inquiring about Olivier's domestic inclinations, including how he preferred his eggs in the morning. Next, Leigh would have to inform her husband of her intentions. Although completely blindsided by such revelations, he did not become angry with either party, and in fact remained a lifelong friend of his wife, possibly in the hope that she might return someday. Although Olivier had already purchased a cottage in Chelsea as the couple's new residence, it was not ready, so they both moved to a small apartment until renovations were complete. The couple was also juggling a film produced by Alexander Korda, who had worked with both before, a difficult production initially entitled The First and the Last. Although filming was completed in 1937, the film sat unreleased until Vivien Leigh's subsequent stardom and the film's distribution in 1941 with a new title, 21 Days. Olivier and Leigh also left young children behind, Leigh's daughter Suzanne, almost 4 years old, to be raised by a nanny, and then eventually by Vivien's mother, Gertrude. Vivien interacted with her ex frequently and personally, and even offered to interview and hire the nanny herself, but she would no longer live with her child. Although Laurence Olivier also left a child behind, his son was a veritable infant, at least for the moment, his departure not as traumatic. Both Jill Esmond and Leigh Holman initially refused to even discuss a divorce. At first, Olivier and Leigh would have to be satisfied with merely living together. Like much of the Western world, by 1937, Vivien Leigh had read the remarkably popular Civil War novel Gone with the Wind. Like most aspiring actresses working in the industry, at that time she recognized the cinematic potential of the book and that the role of Scarlett O'Hara would be a career maker. Encouraged by producer Alexander Korda, who had a contractual relationship with both Leigh and Olivier and wanted more American exposure for the 2 of them, Vivien, in any interviews during the time period, openly discussed how much she loved the book and her eagerness to play the role of Scarlett. In fact, Hollywood was also quick to acknowledge the novel's potential. Within a month of the book's release, producer David O. Selznick purchased the film rights for $50,000, the most ever paid at that time for a first novel. To further raise awareness of Leigh in Hollywood, Korda negotiated the loan of Leigh to MGM for the Robert Taylor vehicle, A Yank at Oxford. The studio at first reluctant, but agreeing when it was pointed out that as the film was being produced in Britain, Leigh would not incur the expensive transportation costs of an actress based in Hollywood. Although Leigh did incur some hostility during filming for being difficult, the film upon release was both well-reviewed and profitable. Her performance generated a substantial offer from Paramount to sign a lengthy contract. She had her agent propose a much shorter contractual arrangement and much higher numbers, demands so unrealistic that the studio did not even respond. By then, in December of 1937, Vivien and Olivier were starring in an old Vic production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. As Leigh contemplated the new year of 1938, now ensconced with Olivier in their Chelsea cottage, she became determined to extricate herself from her marriage, both her husband and Jill Esmond still not willing to grant this request. Up to this point, Olivier and Leigh had been relatively discreet in pursuing this relationship. Only friends and industry associates were aware of the situation. Vivien then resolved to go public with Olivier, embarking together on a lengthy vacation in France, and in September as a couple attending the wedding of Stuart Granger. While on the road, Olivier received an offer from independent producer Samuel Goldwyn to star as Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. A lengthy negotiation ensued, not over money, but from Olivier's desire to have Vivien play Cathy, the featured female role in the film. The director, William Wyler, was willing to offer Vivien a less prominent role, which she declined, resulting in a physical separation when Olivier proceeded to California, embarking from the port of Southampton. Although the film would be a Hollywood career breakthrough for Olivier, production was difficult from the outset. The director, William Wyler, felt that Olivier's whole approach to film was all wrong, that the theatrics and dramatic approach that worked on stage was too overstated for motion pictures. The two fought endlessly on the set, Wyler demanding as many as 70 takes on the same scene, and when asked what specifically he was looking for, he would reply, "I just wanted better," an impossibly unclear direction. Olivier missed Vivien Leigh to the point of obsession, sending her approximately 200 letters, many lengthy efforts, with numerous sketches included. Despite the absurd cost of long-distance phone calls, he routinely spoke to her by telephone. From her perspective, Vivien worried about Olivier potentially reverting to his unfaithful ways. That certainly was not going to happen with his leading lady, Merle Oberon. Olivier fought with her as much as with the director, the two descending to trading insults on the set, despite previously having worked amicably with each other. For months, filming dragged on, a tedious, unhappy process. Finally, with nothing going on in her professional life, Vivien Leigh decided that she would give in to his continual requests and head to California. By the time she disembarked in New York from the Queen Mary, there were 3 cables from Olivier. She did not even stay overnight, getting on an American Airlines flight immediately. It was December 1938. Although her main motivation in coming to California was to reunite with Olivier, Vivien Leigh was immediately drawn into the industry buzz concerning the casting of Gone with the Wind. Although still a veritable unknown in Hollywood, she had 2 things going for her. One, an inclination on producer Selznick's part that after auditioning such A-list stars as Bette Davis, Jean Arthur, Katharine Hepburn, and many others, he was interested in casting a new face, and also thought a highly publicized search that resulted in a Cinderella story of some unknown suddenly getting the part of the century would be great publicity for a public that was obsessed with Hollywood glamour. The second positive in what became her quest for the role of Scarlett O'Hara was more personal. Laurence Olivier retained Myron Selznick to represent him in his American film ventures. Upon her arrival in 1938, Leigh also quietly signed with Myron's firm. Selznick was the older brother of David Selznick, and after a stint as an independent producer, he formed one of the first talent agencies in Hollywood in the late 20s. By 1938, he was an industry powerhouse representing some of the biggest actors and behind-the-camera talent in the film industry. He was also aware that his brother was so impatient to start filming Gone with the Wind that on December 10, 1938, David O. Selznick would film the burning of Atlanta with doubles of Rhett and Scarlett driving a buggy through the flames, the casting of Scarlett's role still undetermined. Industry legend has it that Myron showed up with both Olivier and Vivien in tow only minutes after filming was complete. Allegedly, he walked Vivien Leigh into his brother's vicinity and introduced her by saying, "Hey, genius, meet your Scarlett O'Hara," while years of embroidery have attempted to describe this moment as a thunderbolt of destiny in which David O. Selznick was immediately transfixed. In truth, she still faced some serious competition for the role. A few days after this meeting, Selznick mentioned to his wife in a letter that he had narrowed down Scarlett to 4 actresses: Paulette Goddard, Jean Arthur, Joan Bennett, and the fourth, who he described as a dark horse, Vivien Leigh. Vivien still had to undergo some screen tests involving her ability to affect the appropriate Southern accent, but in a matter of weeks, she was signed to the part, and the Cinderella story was complete. But signing Vivien Leigh was also a shrewd business decision by Selznick. As an independent producer, he was obliged to obtain his top-line actors on loan from other major studios, who had these names under long-term contract. In the case of Clark Gable, who the obsessive Selznick decided was a must-have as Rhett Butler, he was forced into a deal that was practically confiscatory. MGM typically did not loan Gable out to other studios, but Selznick had an unbeatable business connection that at least allowed for an attempted negotiation. Studio head Louis B. Mayer was his father-in-law. Eventually, MGM agreed to fund half of the film's budget with $1,250,000 and allow Gable to play the role. In return, the studio would receive 50% of the film's profits. Selznick would pay Gable's weekly salary, a formidable $4,500 a week, and Selznick would also pay a flat distribution fee to Loews Incorporated, MGM's parent company. Comparatively, Leigh's deal was a bargain. $1,250 a week, and a personal services contract lasting the typical 7 years, the legal maximum allowable in California, upon Selznick's insistence. As Leigh already had such a contract with Alexander Korda, the two producers agreed to share her services for 6 months out of every year. When Olivier attempted to involve himself in the negotiations, he was rebuffed by Selznick. As a young producer at RKO in the early 30s, had previously fired Olivier. Selznick's heavy-handedness did nothing to improve the latent hostility between the two individuals. For now, Olivier would have to live with the solace of Vivien getting the opportunity of a lifetime. But this unexpected casting fomented another dramatic problem for the couple. Wuthering Heights wrapped in January 1939, and Olivier sensed that it might be a game changer. He did not wish to stick around Los Angeles getting involved in another project that might be less productive if Wuthering Heights proved to be a breakthrough. Predictably, he signed on for a play in New York, No Time for Comedy. With Vivien Leigh signed to Gone with the Wind, once again the couple was faced with a lengthy separation. They were reunited at the end of March for the Hollywood premiere of Wuthering Heights, a glittering affair attended by Eleanor Roosevelt, Marlene Dietrich, David O. Selznick, and any number of A-list stars. Olivier's performance was lauded by the New York Times as one of those once-in-a-lifetime things, a case of a player physically and emotionally ordained for a role. Within days of this event, Olivier received the news from his sister that his father had died at the age of 69. Not particularly close at that point, he did not return home from New York for the funeral, and based on his physical location in New York, this was also an impossibility. By then, Leigh was deep in the throes of the exhaustive process that went into constructing the epic Gone with the Wind. The film hit an immediate snag when director George Cukor was fired only 2 weeks after filming began. Cukor had a reputation as an excellent director and had worked repeatedly with Selznick when both were employed at RKO. He was crucial to the development of the career of Katharine Hepburn, an actress that initially had difficulty finding her niche in Hollywood. While Selznick never provided any specifics as to why Cukor was let go, disagreements over the script and the pace of filming, which the producer felt was too slow, was one speculation. Clark Gable, who was both a notorious homophobe and anti-Semite, is also said to have lobbied to get rid of Cukor, both Jewish and gay, the latter a well-known secret within the industry. The director had spent 2 years preparing for the production, hired even before Selznick bought the rights to the book. He also spent a great deal of time personally coaching both Vivien Leigh and Olivier de Havilland in developing a realistic Southern accent, as well as character development. His firing was a shock to both actresses, who personally appealed to Selznick to bring him back, to no avail. Film production was completely shut down until Victor Fleming was hired to continue the project. Fleming, who was already involved in the arduous production of MGM's The Wizard of Oz, would assume a backbreaking schedule that quickly left him exhausted and irritable. Vivien didn't get along with co-star Clark Gable, who she considered an uncouth rube who made romantic scenes difficult because he frequently smelled of alcohol. With Selznick growing concerned over production costs and time constraints, Fleming instituted a shooting schedule that frequently stretched from early morning to the early evening. Already hostile to Fleming, who she resented as Cukor's replacement, Leigh became increasingly difficult and disdainful of a director she considered mediocre. Fleming responded by openly deriding her as pompous and haughty, the contentious, unhappy atmosphere adding to Leigh's increasingly fragile psyche, already precarious due to her lengthy separation from Olivier, who continued in New York with no time for comedy. Things got so bad that Selznick himself got on the phone to Olivier and urged him to come to Los Angeles, if only briefly, to try to improve Leigh's state of mind. This the actor did, if only for a few days. The gesture and company seemed to improve the actress's state of mind. However, the ever-changing script was a constant difficulty for the entire cast, and Selznick's perfectionism ensured that the process remained difficult. So draining was the production that Fleming finally collapsed and needed to take 2 weeks off before returning to the studio. Upon his return, the 18-hour days resumed, with filming in various remote outdoor locations in rural areas, the sun and heat adding to the difficulty. Finally, on June 27th, the filming was complete. As soon as she was finished, Vivien Leigh immediately flew to New York. When Olivier finished his theater commitment there, they then returned to Britain, Leigh refusing to return to Los Angeles for requested retakes. They assumed that at least in the short term, they were done with Hollywood. Immediately, Selznick began to attempt to entice Olivier to appear in his next project, a dramatization of the Daphne du Maurier novel Rebecca, another expensive literary property that cost the producer $50,000. With Wuthering Heights having established Olivier as a top star and the male lead role in Rebecca requiring a sophisticated, aristocratic presence, he was an obvious casting choice. When Selznick offered him the role, he waffled, his indecision partly the result of trying to leverage Vivien into the female lead role. Not willing to make such a concession, Selznick then issued an ultimatum combined with a salary that was enticing enough to elicit Olivier's acceptance without any stipulation concerning his wife. Vivien was subsequently informed while the couple was sailing back to the U.S. that she did not get the part. 2 weeks after their arrival in California, Hitler invaded Poland, and the real world intruded on their various Hollywood intrigues. Initially intent on returning to Britain despite their contractual obligations, the couple was told to remain in the U.S. by no less than the British ambassador. It was felt that their value in participating in propagandistic productions and morale-boosting films would far outweigh their desire to express their solidarity with their embattled countrymen. Still, the public was less than understanding, especially when other industry figures like David Niven immediately got involved personally in the war effort. Olivier as a male was especially criticized, and he resorted to taking out his frustration on his eventual co-star in Rebecca, Joan Fontaine, belittled by Olivier and bullied by Hitchcock and the entire production, again micromanaged by Selznick. Somehow, despite this unhappiness and conflict, filming was completed by December 1939. This would allow Olivier to attend the premiere of Gone with the Wind, which took place on December 12, 1939 in Atlanta, Georgia, a mega-media event that even by the standards of the day was a promotional blitzkrieg. A motorcade took the stars of the film from the airport to the center of town, Olivier riding in a separate car from Vivien in an attempt to still hide their relationship. A ball with 6,000 guests subsequently took place, the participants dressed in appropriate Civil War period attire. When the film itself was screened, it was unanimously hailed as one of the finest films ever made. Although criticism in the black press foreshadowed the eventual controversy that has blemished Gone with the Wind's legacy, both critical and popular acclaim at the time was wildly enthusiastic. Initially, prices of up to $1 did not deter the public, who broke attendance records across the nation. In 4 years, it would generate over 60 million admissions, half of the U.S. population at the time, and adjusted for inflation, remains the most lucrative film ever made. The film also catapulted Vivien Leigh to the same superstardom that her significant other had recently obtained. Her personal assistant wrote a letter to her mother Gertrude, which described this media sensation. It would be impossible for me to tell you of her success in the picture. I simply don't know the words and won't attempt it. If you can just imagine the greatest thing that has ever happened in all the world, that's your little Vivien. The whole of our country is positively overwhelmed by her magnificent performance. She is all over every newspaper everywhere, and the most wonderful reviews you have ever read. Such acclaim and the attendant media curiosity removed just about any secrecy concerning a relationship with Olivier. But instead of scandal, such knowledge only seemed to create even more interest in the couple, divorce and separation becoming more common in Western society, and especially in the entertainment industry. Perhaps both the realization that Olivier and Leigh's relationship was not a brief fling, and that it was now practically common knowledge, in January of 1940, both Jill Esmond and Leigh Holman filed legally for a divorce, which was quickly granted. Olivier and Leigh would have to wait 6 months before they could remarry. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Information for this podcast came from the books Truly, Madly by Stephen Galloway, Olivier by Terry Coleman, and Vivien Leigh by Hugo Vickers. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.